Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Nancy Taylor, and I am the Executive Director at the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, I will not have anything to say about music. Presbyterians were singers, but that is not part of my presentation today. I am honored to talk to you, though, about the American founding, using an object from the PHS collections as a jumping-off point. The object I have chosen is a block of wood. On the surface, I'm sure that makes no sense to you. What could this nondescript, relatively small object from the PHS collections possibly have to do with religion and the American founding? Plus, I'm sure it will appall some of you in the audience to know that when you turn over the block of wood, there's a label stuck to it. However, I can assure you that the donor of the object and my predecessors at PHS did think it was worth collecting and preserving. We actually have a number of wood fragments, nails, hinges, and other stray parts from historic churches and other Presbyterian structures. I like to think of these as disconnected fragments. I like to think of these disconnected fragments as the Presbyterian version of relics. This particular fragment is from Tusculum, pictured here in a 20th century lantern slide. Tusculum was built as the country house of Reverend John Witherspoon, several years before the start of the Revolutionary War. The house near Princeton, New Jersey, still stands today, so I cannot tell you exactly how a chunk of wood beam ended up at PHS. My guess is that the beam was replaced during a long ago renovation. I bring Tusculum to your attention today as a way to consider the legacy of founding father John Witherspoon, the only active clergyman and college head to sign the Declaration of Independence. Unlike many of his fellow signers, Witherspoon was both Like many of his fellow signers, Witherspoon was both an influential leader and an owner of enslaved people. For centuries, however, his legacy did not account for his involvement with slavery. This block of wood allows me to advocate for wrestling with Witherspoon in all his dimensions and complexities, for it was at Tusculum that at least 2 enslaved people owned by Witherspoon worked and lived. This is the famous painting of John Witherspoon by Charles Willson Peale, completed around 1783. Let me briefly share some background. John Witherspoon was born in Scotland in 1723, the oldest child of a pastor. He attended the University of Edinburgh and then served 2 parishes as a Church of Scotland minister in Scotland. He was 45 years old, a husband and a father, when 2 Americans, Benjamin Rush and Richard Stockton, who also became founding fathers, by the way, persuaded him to emigrate to America in 1768 to become the next president of the College of New Jersey, which is now known as Princeton University. This is the first known image of Nassau Hall at the College of New Jersey. It was completed a dozen years before Witherspoon's arrival, when Aaron Burr was college president. The school had been organized by Presbyterian pastors and chartered in the 1740s, and at the time it was built, Nassau Hall was the largest academic building in the American colonies. Thus, immigrating to head the College of New Jersey was not a bad gig for Witherspoon, especially given both his connections and the college's connections to prominent Americans of that era. By most accounts, Witherspoon was an excellent choice for the college. He built a reputation as a dynamic preacher, an engaged teacher, and a colonial leader, not just in Presbyterian, religious, and educational circles, but increasingly in politics as well. 250 years ago, 2 months before he began serving in the Continental Congress, in the Second Continental Congress, Witherspoon preached a sermon titled, "The Dominion of Providence over the Passions of Men." Historian James Davis says this sermon became one of the most well-known and influential sermons of the Revolution. The quote I've highlighted for you on the slide captures for me the key takeaways. Witherspoon believed it necessary to justify speaking about politics from the pulpit. But he also made a strong case that God would side with the patriots because their cause was just. 1776 was just the beginning of Witherspoon's prominence. Over the next 15 years, he continued to lead as a Presbyterian, an educator, and an American patriot. He served in Congress until 1784. He signed the Articles of Confederation, and he supported ratification of the U.S. Constitution. He would head the College of New Jersey until his death in 1794. Thus, during 2 key decades in the history of the United States, a major inflection point between past and future, John Witherspoon influenced the course of American Presbyterianism and American history. I want to return to that block of wood from Tusculum. While it is not clear when John Witherspoon acquired the 2 enslaved persons listed in his estate at the time of his death, most historians believe it was tied to his need for labor at Tusculum when it became his primary residence in 1779. Witherspoon was not an anomaly in owning slaves. The College of New Jersey's first 9 presidents all owned enslaved people at some point in their lives. Unfortunately, little is known about the enslaved people at Tusculum. For example, I could not find their names. And historian James Davis says Witherspoon never wrote about them in any of his surviving correspondence. What we do have as evidence is what John Witherspoon did say and did not say in his surviving writings, what actions he did take and not take. In other words, with a wider perspective, we begin to understand the parameters that bounded Witherspoon's quote-unquote just cause. He did not believe, as some did, that enslavement was a benevolent practice supported by the Bible. He thought slavery would disappear in the United States within a generation. But he never called for abolition, and his political leadership kept people enslaved in New Jersey longer than any other northern state. While compatriots like Benjamin Rush and religious denominations like the Quakers argued openly for abolishing slavery, Witherspoon chose to side instead with slave interests in his own life, in Congress, at the college where he mingled with and taught enslavers, and in the Presbyterian Church. In 1787, the top governing body of the church came very close to passing a call for immediate abolition. But the final overture was amended, and the body endorsed a gradual approach to ending slavery over an unspecified period of time. 2 years later, John Witherspoon convened and gave the opening sermon at the first General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America. And that assembly also chose to follow that same gradual emancipation course. Thus, while individual Presbyterians may have believed that enslavement was a sin and should be abolished in the new nation, Witherspoon's view of slavery prevailed at the denominational level, just as it did in the national government. And in New Jersey, Quakers and their allies had agitated for abolition throughout Witherspoon's tenure in America. It's not as if he never heard these arguments or interacted with people who were calling for abolition. In 1790, Witherspoon had an opportunity to directly influence state law in New Jersey when he served on a 3-man committee studying possible legislative action on slavery in that state. The committee recommended against full abolition. And New Jersey, again, was the last northern state to pass the gradual emancipation law in 1804. And in fact, slavery continued to exist on a small scale in the state until the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Until recently, Presbyterians heaped honor and praise on John Witherspoon, lifting up his revolutionary era renown as a preacher, educator, and politician. And don't get me wrong, he did excel at those things. For example, when the national headquarters of the Presbyterian Church USA moved into a new building in Louisville, Kentucky in the 1980s, it christened the street outside the building as Witherspoon Street. And closer to home, at the Presbyterian Historical Society, we have the responsibility of wrestling with Witherspoon and his legacy on a daily basis. The statue in the previous slide is one of 6 that stand before our building today. One of them is Witherspoon, and the picture from a more distant perspective, he is the person in the middle, and then in the one closer up, that statue is, again, the one in the middle. Today, we believe that PHS must tell a more nuanced history of these 6 white men, at least half of whom were enslavers. It is not the easiest work. Sources can be hard to come by. And as we've seen recently, there are powerful forces in this country who are succeeding to a certain extent in returning us to a quote-unquote positive, one-sided view of history. That brings me back to where I started, with a piece of wood from Witherspoon's Tusculum estate. I'll share that there are actually 2 blocks of wood in the PHS collection from Tusculum, although I don't know much about the second one. It is doubtful that the donors of these wood blocks saw them as anything more than a representation of Witherspoon's renown. However, they prompt me to think about the 2 enslaved people who worked at Tusculum and how slavery cannot be separated from the history of the United States and of American Presbyterianism. I hope their existence may remind you to approach history critically as well, to ask hard questions, and to hold together things that we may think are easier or better to split apart. Thank you.